joining us for this Thursday keynote session of this year's Conference on Expanding Access to International Affairs. The session will be a conversation with Sewell Chan. I am Millie Tran, the Vice President and Chief Digital Content Officer at CFR, and I will be presiding over today's conversation. So to begin, I'll do a brief introduction of Sewell, and then we'll do about 30 minutes of conversation and then open it up to all of your very smart questions. So Sewell, thank you for joining us. Sewell Chan is an editor, writer, and innovator. He's currently a senior fellow at USC Annenberg Center for Communication, Leadership, and Policy, focusing on the fight for press freedom in the US and abroad. Most recently, Sewell served as editor of the Columbia Journalism Review. Prior to that, he was editor-in-chief of the Texas Tribune. Under his leadership, the Tribune won its first National Magazine Award and was a first-time Pulitzer finalist. Before joining the Tribune, Sewell was a deputy managing editor and then the editorial page editor at the LA Times, where he oversaw coverage that was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for editorial writing in 2021. Sewell started his career at the Washington Post and was at the New York Times from 2004 to 2018, where we worked together, as a Metro reporter, then a Washington correspondent, deputy op-ed editor, and then international news editor. Chan is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and PEN America. He also serves on the boards of the Pulitzer Prizes, the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, the Henry Luce Foundation, Freedom House, and Harvard Magazine, and on the national judging panel of the Livingston Award, and we can ask him when he sleeps. Sewell was born in New York City. He's the son of Chinese immigrants and the first in his family to graduate from college. He has an AB in social studies from Harvard and an MPhil in politics from Oxford, and he currently lives in New York. So let's start with your personal journey and early career. I'm sure everyone will want to hear about how you got from Queens, Flushing, Queens, to all of this. So
the subway.
So you, shout out to the MTA. You've described being the son of immigrants as deeply formative. How did that upbringing shape your worldview and journalistic values?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. And first of all, I'm sorry that I sound a little bit like Darth Vader. I am recovering from a bad head cold. So thank you to CFR for the tea and sympathy. I'm really excited to be here and really excited to be here with my friend Millie. It's funny. I don't think when you grow up in an immigrant family, you don't necessarily think of it as being exceptional. I don't know if any of you can relate to that. It just is. My parents were born during World War II, one in mainland China and one in Hong Kong. And obviously, they lived through a lot. In the first decade of their lives, they experienced, let's face it, foreign occupation, Chinese Civil War, and then a communist revolution. That was before they were 10. And but they also didn't talk about that growing up. They had come after a long, complicated journey to the U.S. in the early 1970s. I was their anchor baby. I was the first. Sorry, it's a little loaded. That was a joke. But I was, in fact, the first U.S. citizen in my family, and we're thinking a lot right now about citizenship and about belonging in the American political community. My parents, of course, became citizens, but they actually did so a few years after I was born. And so, growing up, now that I look at it, it was a kind of hybrid world. Neither of my parents has a high school degree. My mom did get a GED, for which I'm very proud of her, in the United States. But my dad only had 5 years of schooling in rural China. He doesn't even really speak, fluent English. He was a restaurant worker, then a cab driver. My mom knows more English because of Hong Kong. She was a secretary. And so, in many ways, I grew up with a foot in both worlds. At the same time, I was born like a year after Mao died. When I was born in the late 70s, the idea that someday, frankly, affluent, well-educated Americans would be paying for their kids to study Chinese, in 1977, that no one would have thought that, right? Which says a lot about subsequent world events. And so I think in some ways, just to not to go on too long, I think growing up in an immigrant family actually helped inform my choice to become a journalist, because I was always interested in language. I was interested in how my own Chinese wasn't that good, so I couldn't understand everything that was being said. And I guess I've always been interested in being curious. And being a journalist is kind of a professional license to be curious. It's a license to learn and to tell stories, true stories, hopefully. And I think I always just enjoyed that. And so in many ways, I think that experience of being feeling a little bit like an outsider, but not seeing that as a source of, in any way, grievance or anything, but seeing that as actually an opportunity to have a license to learn about America, our new homeland. And we could talk about that more, but it was very informative.
Yeah, there's something about being able to live in both worlds that's
Yeah.
a little bit of a superpower. So you've held major roles at the New York Times, the LA Times, and the Text Tribune. What are some threads that connect your career as everyone starts thinking about their careers? And what's changed most about journalism since you've started?
Well, I feel very lucky because I've done a little bit of international work. I spent a few months in 2004 covering the Iraq conflict in Iraq for the Washington Post. On 9/11, I was a young reporter. I was really my second year as a reporter at the Washington Post, and I went to the Pentagon that day. And then later on, I had a stint in London for the New York Times. I feel very grateful for that. But I feel like an international affairs imposter. Like far more years of my career, about half my career has actually been spent on local news. Now, my interest in local stems from the fact that I think that we have a crisis of trust in America. And I don't think that trust easily gets rebuilt from New York and Washington, with all due respect to those wonderful cities. I think it depends a lot on what's happening in our communities across the country, but also here in Queens, right? There are parts of New York City that are becoming news deserts in the sense of there isn't a lot of reliable information at the neighborhood and at the community level about what's going on. And, people will say, I don't trust the news. And I understand that. We could talk a lot about that. Spend a whole hour on that if we wanted to. But I think the path to getting people to trust again probably doesn't start from watching cable news and Washington commentators. It might start from people getting relevant, timely, accurate information about the places they live, the people, the elected leaders in their communities. And so I feel very, very passionate that local news is part of the solution. And of course, it's eroded in America. It's the local news, the level of news that has kind of eroded the most as the advertising model collapsed and the newspapers collapsed, right? And so at the Texas Tribune, which we both also worked at, we just missed each other there, but we both share that experience of having worked there. We were both at a pioneering nonprofit newsroom that's trying to cover state government on behalf of Texans with a community-supported, member-supported model, no paywall, no advertising, but not really traditional advertising. And so that was really, really exciting. So I think the connective thread has been telling true stories that are relevant, that are meaningful, and trying to do what journalists do best, which is chronicle, document, observe, and explain. And I still find a great deal of excitement and meaning in those tasks, 25 years in.
Yeah, I just want to go back to your crisis with trust. We will definitely talk about it because I think understanding everyone's information habits, our own and kind of the people around us, is so important right now.
We are what we eat or what we read or don't read.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it very much is an information diet. So looking back at your big break in journalism, what do you wish someone had told you that you now tell others, since this is a early career conference after all?
Well, that's a great question. And I'm thinking about, I wish if I could go back and talk to myself in my early 20s, first of all, I would have said, you need to chill out a little bit. Like, you can't keep going at this pace. Just relax, things will work out. I think the second thing I would have said, and perhaps even more relevant today, is that I'm a Gen Xer, right? A young Gen Xer, and I'm probably the idea that a career is one thing or defined by one institution or a title or even one field or discipline. Honestly, I meet a lot of people in their early 20s. They just don't think that way. And they, we both worked at the New York Times, where a lot of people worked for decades, right? And when I joined the New York Times, I was like, they're going to have to carry me out of here feet first. And I still love the place. But, a career is, and I think younger people inherently intuit this. I used to think, it's only what's after the @ symbol, the email address that matters. We're just individuals. We're serving this greater cause. And I love missions. I love mission-driven work. I love institutions. But the reality is that each of us also has to be our own personal, hate the word, brand. Not in the sense necessarily, although there probably are some influencers here, not in the sense of necessarily marketing, but in the sense of you are your own brand in the sense of your integrity, your intellectual work, the body of what you know, and the body of what you've experienced. And that is part of your brand in a positive sense. You're not selling soap. You're representing the fullness of who you are and authentically embracing who you are. And I think that personal brand has only become more important because let's face it, a lot of Americans, a lot of people don't trust institutions quite the way they once did. But they might trust someone who's at an institution who can reach them in ways that are authentic and faithful and valid and relevant. And I think that's where personal brand at its most powerful comes in. And I say that as someone who remains a committed institutionalist.
Yeah, it's that balance between institutionalists and kind of individual brands, I think, is very much merging and blurring.
Yeah.
Because what are institutions if not made of people? So you've led in moments of profound change, whether that was economic disruption during COVID, reckonings over race and inclusion, and now the rise of AI, which we can also talk about for an hour. What's the hardest part about leading a newsroom today or leading anything today? And what have you learned about leadership in the process?
I think that the level of comfort with uncertainty that you have to have is something that's difficult. If I can just be fully candid, I think it's difficult for someone of my generation because, like the Berlin Wall fell when I was like 11, like the March of Freedom and Progress. I mean, with some very important exceptions, but in general, I would say growing up in the 80s as an immigrant child, and again, I didn't grow up in a political family. I wasn't, but in general, there was a sense that there was an expansion of freedom and opportunity. And I don't think it was just my impression, right? I'm on the board of Freedom House, which has found that the kind of the peak year in terms of the proportion of humanity living in like kind of really free countries was kind of in the mid-aughts. The Freedom House and other scholars like Larry Diamond have talked about how the world is in a democratic recession. Doesn't mean democratic collapse, but it does mean that for various reasons around the world, since 2006, there have been fewer people living in fully free societies. Now, of course, the reasons for that are very complex, and I'm not an expert. But I think that part of it is like the life experience. So I think I grew up in a more optimistic time. Now, the last decade, or really even the period since 9/11, when I began my career, right, have been very tumultuous times. And so I think that kind of being comfortable with uncertainty, being comfortable with the idea that you're making decisions that you can with limited information, and that none of us is omniscient, much less omnipotent, and that we learn with each other, we learn with our teams. I think that's the hardest part right now. There's also a lot of generational changes going on in America. And I think that there's a lot of conversations across generations, which are important to have and important to acknowledge. So I think those are some of the key things I think about. We can, of course, talk about the disruption and the AI, but I think first of all, we have to talk about, being comfortable with the idea that there isn't that we're not on settled ground, and the ground beneath us is constantly shifting.
That what you just said reminded me of this quote that I stumbled upon during the pandemic. It was from this Buddhist monk whose name I cannot remember right now. But it was that the bad news is you're falling. The good news is there's no ground. So just get used to that feeling. So this conference is all about expanding access to international affairs. What does that phrase mean to you as a journalist and someone engaged with CFR and global issues? We just had this conversation. Like, there's this journalism world and this international affairs world. How do you think about both of those or them together?
Yeah, so I came to this conference, I think, for the first time, 2 years ago in DC. And with all due respect to all the wonderful events CFR does, I was like, this is the most inspiring CFR conference ever. And I really mean that because look, CFR is like a very long, old, distinguished institution. It's in a beautiful building, both here in DC. If you had asked me growing up, what is CFR, even though I was just 2 subway rides away, I had no clue, obviously. And still, when I'm in this building, I feel like an imposter, right? And there are change makers and decision makers and tons of inspiring speeches that happen here. But I think this conference is actually really, really important because this is about the future. And, the term I almost want to question in the term international affairs is, like, what's the future of the nation state? I think there are a lot of, people who living online, like, global is not a thing. It's not global versus domestic anymore. I think a lot of people who live their lives digitally already are part of global youth culture, for example, or a global culture, whether it's, short video or what have you. And that, in some ways our institutions and our leaders are catching up to the reality of how young people already are living their lives and how they're experiencing their sense of identity. So I think, first of all, the boundaries between domestic and foreign we used to call the team that
Yeah.
Millie and I overlapped on was
The
called
foreign desk.
the foreign desk, right? And it was, very like post World War II, right? The national versus foreign. It was renamed international, which I think is a slight improvement. But the whole point is that we should almost question these categories, right? No, that doesn't mean that nations are going away. In fact, I gather that nationalism is back with a vengeance. But I do think that your generation of emerging leaders is really already living a life that is in an existence that's very hybrid, multipolar, multi-perspective, and certainly part of the multi-faith and multiracial, multi-ethnic, pluralistic democracy that America is and is becoming, even if that becoming is painful or slow.
Just to kind of build off on the theme of this conference, the other theme of this conference is about underrepresented voices in international affairs, or however we think about the world today. Which voices or communities do you think are still systematically overlooked in foreign policy journalism?
Yeah.
And how do we change that?
Yeah, it's a really, really great set of questions. I'll start by saying that, I welcome conversations around concepts like diversity and equity and access. And sometimes I think as a society, we're getting a little bit too much tripped up on the terminology, the nomenclature, and we should just start to maybe talk about the ground level ideas. I think we can all agree that our institutions are stronger if they're more representative of and reflective of the communities that we come from and seek to serve. Let's just start there, plain, simple English. Now, of course, that includes diversity, racial, ethnic, gender, sexual orientation, etc. It also means that we're called right now as people who've had some success and privilege in our lives to look at who's been left out. We're called upon right now, if we have a 4-year college degree, which most of the people in our room have, 60% of American adults don't, right? And so right now there's an anger right now. We talk for hours about how much of that anger, where it's coming from, how it's being shaped, how it's being manipulated. But I think there's an anger that's real against perceived elite institutions. And I don't think the answer, personally, is tear down the institutions. But I do think it means that we have to take that concept of elitism seriously. Now, there's a good way. I don't think the word elite necessarily has to be bad. I mean, we like watching elite athletes, right? I mean, we like watching elite Hollywood performers, I guess. I don't know. But when it comes to institutions in American life, I think that improving access and representativeness, that includes people from the American heartland, it includes people from low-income or working-class communities right here in the Bronx. So you have to think about opportunity, and I think advancing the conversation. I'm going to be very frank, and I welcome pushback. I think we sometimes have to shift the conversation from identity, which I think both left and right have emphasized a lot, shifting it to opportunity. Because when we're talking about opportunity, that's a pretty universal message. We all like to move ahead, and that appeals to people who are members of communities of color, historically disadvantaged communities, but it might also appeal to people in rural communities or faith-based communities, and communities that are, so you want me to list some communities, veteran communities, vastly underrepresented in journalism. People with disabilities still suffer from a lot of invisibility. And by the way, they represent people of all races, faiths, and backgrounds. Honestly, to be very frank, at the New York Times, and I'm Asian American, I'm gay, whatever, the loneliest identity I felt sometimes was being a first-generation college graduate. Because there weren't that many. I'm not trying to knock the Times, and I think they're trying to do better. But it's how many of if you don't mind me asking, are there any folks here who are first-generation college graduates? Okay, good for you. I'm sorry, thank you for, yes. But and I've started identifying myself that way more too, because I think it's an identity that actually is important. It's important to spell out and say, because it's actually a very identity we've all been there. Everyone in our family was at some point a first-generation college graduate, right? And so I think, having a broader conversation around access and inclusion is good. Unfortunately, some of the ways that the conversation has happened around DEIB have, of course, been less productive. We can talk about that if you wish.
Yeah, there's, I think, shifting it from not being scared of the words we use, but really acting on our values and how do we live those values in everything that we do. So let's look ahead a little bit. I think we have about 15 more minutes. We're in a moment of rapid technological disruption and eroding public trust, as you mentioned. What excites you about the future of journalism, and what keeps you up at night?
Yeah, and so I'll start with the things I'm excited about, and actually, this partly addresses
Yeah.
your immediate prior question. You know, international journalism used to mean, let's face it, like correspondence from Western news organizations covering the world. Not all of it was necessarily bad. There was a lot of journalism at places like the New York Times and the Washington Post, which expanded substantially after World War II. And in America, that was kind of dominant in the world, more curious about the world, there were great journalists who went out and covered decolonization, new nation states in Latin America and Africa, changes across the Iron Curtain during the Cold War. So I'm not saying by any means that it was bad or good, but it was complicated. But it tended to be, frankly, uh, uh, tended to be white men from the United States, right? Kind of like covering it and explaining the world to Americans. That mission is by no means invalid, but it's more complicated. And those narratives were incomplete because it was less it was more of a one-way kind of conversation. Now every conversation is from multiple sources to multiple audiences. So even at places like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, you see that many more of the journalists are covering the countries that they live in and have lived in. And it used to be like, oh, do they have the training that American journalists have? Well, I just taught at Columbia recently, where like half the students are international. So a lot of them are going, they're coming here for perhaps graduate training, but then they're going back and telling the stories of where they're from, which I think is really important. I think there's always going to be a role for American journalists to go to other places and tell stories. And there's a role that we Americans need to should respect about the journalists from other countries who are here in Washington covering our political situation from a comparative and from a historical perspective. We have a lot to learn from them. Have any of you read those kind of satirical stories that cover the U.S. like written in a way that like the U.S. writes about the other world, like the ruling regime, the presidential palace, these kind of sometimes lazy shorthands, right? And it's like I don't mean to overstate it, but I do think that there are sometimes these tropes, right? And I think that a more international way of looking at America is really important right now, because you can't look at the U.S. right now. You can't understand what's going on here without a comparative and historical perspective. So to answer your question more succinctly, I'm very excited about who's going into journalism, because frankly, the prestige and the stability have kind of left the building like years ago. And so the people doing it right now at the local level, investigative level, at the explanatory level, they're really committed to what they want to do. Like this is their mission. And I suspect that's true of a lot of you in this room. Like you want to be engaged global citizens. Maybe you're not entirely sure what institution or what pathway or what discipline or sub-discipline you want to specialize in. That's okay. But you're committed to this line or this way of being in the world. And I think that dedication that I see among journalists is incredible. Also, many more journalists are independent. I don't need to tell you all about Substack, but so many people are online, creators. And I think institutions are grappling with that. Like, wait, this person has a huge audience on YouTube explaining the world, but they don't have a PhD and they haven't traveled to 28 countries. Well, yeah, but if they're actually explaining things reasonably accurately and in a way that's accessible and relevant, and they're reaching young people, like that sounds like journalism. So I think that we have to be a lot more open-minded about what we consider to be journalism. Now, that said, I do think that journalism is a craft and a calling. And I do think that there are journalistic standards. Journalism's not like medicine or law, fortunately or unfortunately. You can't really be disbarred. I'd like to see some journalists be disbarred. But what it is a craft grounded in truth, curiosity, empathy, accuracy, precision, fair-mindedness. So I don't think you can't it's not like you get a license to be a journalist. But at the same time, I think I know what good journalism is or looks like or sounds like. And I think that sense of excitement is very palpable for me. And then briefly, what keeps me up at night? I mean, all of it, right? How can any of us wake up and see the alerts sometimes even in the middle of the night? I'm struck by how rapidly AI is changing how we work. And I again, we can spend a whole hour on this, but there's parts of me that are pessimistic because I think we're all still adapting to the world, the digital age in general, even though it's 30 years in. But I also think that in some ways, I look at the things that I don't see the bots doing anytime soon. And a lot of that involves interpersonal skills of building trust, understanding people deeply, getting people to open up. I don't think a bot can do that right away. In a weird way, it's kind of crazy that the bots can now do basic computer programming. So some of the jobs threatened now, unfortunately, are like developer and coder jobs. But it's like the jobs that will require a deep understanding of history, context, place, understanding human psychology, understanding what motivates people, what people are afraid of, what they care about. I don't see that being done by a computer right away. So I think that gives me a little bit of hope.
That's good. I'm glad you've set yourself as an optimist in this.
I've rarely been called that.
So I should say, for those who are pursuing a career in international affairs, I think it's incredible to be able to live through like all of these tectonic shifts in the world order. So that's exciting, but also keeps me up at night. So for students and early career professionals watching all of this change, what's your advice for finding their place and their purpose?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So to go back to what I said earlier, like I'm not the kind, like I really admire actually. I mean, I have friends who like going back to middle school, like they wanted to do a certain field, like become like a heart doctor or study a certain place. I remember in college, like I knew people who were like, I want to do Central Asia. And I'm like, I had never like left the United States until after college. That was like really intense for me to hear. And I wasn't one of those people, and it's turned out okay. That said, I also think it's great to have an area of specialization. And so I don't think that, first of all, I don't think that everything's becoming more interdisciplinary and everything's becoming more comparative. So I think even if like, Condoleezza Rice, like what her dissertation was like on the Czech army or something, right? And she didn't end up, I mean, obviously, ultimately the Soviet Union fell and right, whatever she knew about the Czech army in the 1970s, probably not the same world order she was leading as Secretary of State. But it's just an example of, I think that having a grounding discipline is important. My discipline is journalism, it's storytelling. It's ultimately a very narrative discipline. I think that's the heart of journalism. Your discipline might be economics. It might be strategy. It might be, political science. It could be sociology. It could be humanistic, literature and ideas. So I think you need to have a disciplinary grounding. And then I think, your specializations will emerge from there. I'm less someone who believes in like starting at age 20 with I know exactly how life is going to unfold, because really everything's super unpredictable right now. And I think when I was a young person, I was like, this is how the next decades will unfold. And now I'm like, can we just get through the next 2.5 to 3 years? And even that feels like so I think that's happening society-wide, first of all. And I actually think that there's opportunity there, but there's an opportunity there for those who are open-minded and flexible and nimble. And just don't be rigid. It's just generally not a good time to be like super rigid and fixed in one's worldview, because honestly, that's not helping us, right? And the people who are most locked in on their ideology or where they're coming from or their political orientation, I think that's not helping the problems that we have right now. So that doesn't mean don't have convictions, but it does mean that being open to the convictions and the beliefs of others. I think that's also part of, building a career. Because ultimately careers are also built, as the last thing I'll say, on relationships. Like I have sources that I first interviewed like 25 years ago and like I've stayed in touch with, and they're different parts of the country, certainly perhaps a range of political leanings, but a lot of the trust, the people you meet in your 20s and get to bond with are people, if you're in this for the long term, you will be in touch with when you're in your 40s and 50s. And so just be kind to people. Like, be kind to people now, because I also observed in the places I've worked, the people who at age 24 are kind to like the 20-year-old college intern, like are kind of the people who 20, 30 years later are still successful because they understand giving back from a very early age.
Yeah, so strong convictions, loosely held, and be kind. Sounds good. Before we open it up,
More cons-
that is me. I'm very good at summarizing, but I can do that really well. So before we open it up, if you could leave this group with one challenge to carry forward, what would it be?
Well, I think the challenge is kind of what I just to elaborate on what I was just talking about. I think one of my strengths, and I got this from being an op-ed editor at the New York Times, like my best interactions as an editor were actually working on subjects I knew nothing about or on viewpoints that I probably disagreed with. Because my kind of super strength was like kind of really understanding, you have this too, really understanding what the person is trying to say and help them say it better. And those of you who've done scholastic debate know this, right? Arguing a position that you may not personally hold or that you might vehemently oppose. It's an incredibly strong skill, an important skill, and I wish we taught it more. I wish we all embraced it more. Because my most positive interactions was, I remember I edited one piece by a Republican governor who was very opposed to same-sex marriage. I happened to be a gay person. I didn't agree with him. But at the end of the process, his staff was like, this piece has gotten better, more persuasive. I was like, okay, is that a good thing? but it was also a good faith argument. It was an argument that's based on evidence. And that was the standard for the New York Times. You can't just make wild assertions. You have to make arguments based on evidence. Now, isn't that a skill we're lacking right now? So I think that part of what I would just take away with is like, hone that skill in your own daily habits. What we read is really important. I read conservative and sometimes right-wing media most days. Not necessarily with agreeing. I don't usually, but I need to understand what a lot of Americans are consuming. Because if I don't understand that, I'm not going to be a very effective American in the kind of spaces I want to have influence in. And I don't mean to just single out the far right, because there's a lot of ideological media of all kinds right now. And so I think a lot of young people I already see doing it, but it's good doing even more of it. Pluralism is good. Reading variety of things is good. Yeah, reading things that piss you off, good. Not gratuitously, but to understand how other people are thinking and talking about and framing things. I heard recently that a friend at law school was lamenting that some law students are having trouble with the idea of precedents that they don't agree with. And I'm like, okay, but you're going to be making arguments before judges. So you need to understand the other side's point of view and even be able to articulate it. It's going to make your own beliefs more stronger. It's going to make your own messaging more persuasive. If you can really try to, and I'm not just saying mimic, I'm saying actually empathetically try to understand where someone with a different point of view is coming from. I just think that act of empathy will also help us communicate better and ultimately make us all individually and collectively more effective.
I love that challenge of figuring out how to argue, how to debate, how to have civic discourse and talk with people of all different opinions. It can be hard.
Well, if we stop talking, we start shooting, right? I mean, we don't want any of that, especially not at CFR.
Yeah. Okay, so at this time, I'd love to invite you all to join the conversation with your questions. As a reminder, the session is on the record, and we will take our first question from our in-person participants here in New York. I think you had your hand up first very quickly. I think someone will come over with a mic.
Okay. All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Shabbir. I'm from Buffalo, New York. I own a media company. The media company stems for 3 C's, which are connections, collaborations, and content. Now, I wanted to personally ask you, how do you think the next level of collaborations through content encourage the excitement of journalism?
You mean how journalistic collaborations are unfolding?
Because the thing is, if you're a journalist now, you have an access to a lot of connections and a lot of different avenues that normal people might not have. Right, so I personally help people get representation in different features and different publications. How do you think has that applied to you in your journey personally, as well as how you think will that happen in the future? Because with the AI coming and media companies bringing more and more people together, I hope I'm making sense.
Yeah, if I'm understanding right, let me talk about the field that I know about, which is journalistic collaboration. At the Texas Tribune, we worked with Frontline in a really, really effective way after there was a horrible shooting at an elementary school. And they knew how to tell stories through documentary film. And we had a lot of sources in Texas. And so I think that the future of journalism, especially as newsrooms are becoming smaller, is that they increasingly have to collaborate in joint forces. So I think it's a very, very positive field, positive development in journalism.
Let's go back there with the pink shirt. Yeah.
Hi everyone. My name's Noah, and I'm a master's student in international affairs at Columbia. So I was wondering if you could give some insight into why there hasn't been a correction for a lot of bias that people have noticed in mostly, I've heard it discussed in regards to the legacy media, legacy press, and even specifically one of your former workplaces, the New York Times. I'm mostly just wondering because this is a situation that I've heard a lot of people talk about and acknowledge, but there doesn't really seem to be an effort to, as I said, correct those failures in journalistic standards.
Well, that's a huge question. Can you be a little bit more specific about the kind of bias that you're talking about?
Well, I think many people are concerned with different types of biases. I know a lot of people have been concerned with very far left media, not giving proper accounts of certain things. I will say that I'm wondering specifically about the New York Times with respect to their reporting on conflicts in the Middle East.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, certainly can't speak for the Times, but what I do think about a lot is the perception that the media is biased, which is frankly a perception that probably most Americans hold at this point, right? And so, the challenge with this is that it kind of comes from all sides, which doesn't mean there's a false belief that if everybody's angry, you're doing something right. No, if everybody's angry, you might be doing a lot of things wrong. So I don't believe that. But that said, the challenge right now is that we're a very polarized society. Now, media may have contributed to that polarization, but media is also in some ways the recipient of that polarization. And we all know the filter bubbles, echo chambers problem, that people are gravitating towards sources that reinforce or confirm their existing beliefs or worldviews. Now, I happen to think that the media, the mainstream media, has to take a lot of responsibility. And I think because we can't just blame it on, the readers, they're confused or whatever. And the bad faith actors, of which there are many, by the way. But I think that, look, we have to be very transparent about our methods and our processes. That's important. We have to be very transparent about distinguishing news from opinion, which I think we've been less successful at. And I've edited on both the news side and the opinion side. I think a little bit of opinion surrounded by a lot of facts is the proper ratio. But right now, there's a lot of opinion and commentary. Certainly, if we turn on cable TV, the main thing we're getting is kind of commentary. And I think a lot of people have gotten a little bit tired of it. They're like, just let me know what happened and let me make my own judgments. And I think that we have to come back to that as journalists. We have to remind ourselves that we're fact-based and supply context, but we shouldn't go so far as to tell people what to think, and certainly not who to vote for. So that's kind of where I stand on that.
Let's go there in the blue. Yeah.
Beautiful. Hey everyone. So one of my pet peeves is paywalls. And early on, I'm Jalen from New York. I work for a company called the Tent Partnership for Refugees. But like I said, one of my pet peeves is paywalls. You mentioned news deserts earlier on in the conversation. I'm curious how media institutions can balance the economic and business incentives that they have with the kind of mandate to provide news access to everybody.
Yeah, that's a terrific question. Thank you for asking it. I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all solution. I love the New York Times, I subscribe. I love the Financial Times, and I subscribe. Both, and the Wall Street Journal, they're great brands. They also appeal, if we're frank, to highly educated people who are very sophisticated and often are influential decision makers. That's great. Influential decision makers need accurate information. It's all good. That's not necessarily going to reach the problem of the tens, if not hundreds of millions of Americans who are lacking reliable local information. So you've identified a core problem. I think part of the solution, first of all, is public media. And unfortunately, we're seeing a cutback right now in Corporation for Public Broadcasting, PBS, NPR. And by the way, when people think PBS and NPR, they think, sometimes it's they're left wing and they're based in DC. But the average PBS or NPR station is more likely to be concentrated in a rural community, a less well-served community, a less information-rich community. So can we please try to support public media, recognizing that it's as diverse as America itself? That's point one. Thank you. Secondly, I think nonprofits play a big role. That's why I was drawn to the Texas Tribune and its model. Everything was free to read. Millie and I were both drawn to that ideal.
And free to republish.
And free to republish, right? So a very different model. So look, there's not going to be one size fits all. Journalists also need to make a living. I get that because these are a lot of my friends. And so I don't think everyone can afford to be free. I do think that many institutions do feel pressure especially when there's a major emergency, to make information free. Because you don't, like, there's been a deadly flood or an earthquake, whatever, you don't want to like be putting that information behind a paywall. So I think there's movement on that. But I would like to see a mix, like a freemium model where some content is free. And if you want to get, let's say, the more advanced or specialized content, you need to pay. I think there are still experiments in that to be found. But yeah, I mean, as much as I love the premium brands, that's not going to be enough to solve the information crisis. So the problem you have identified is a very thorny one, and it's going to continue to be for a while.
Can I add just one thing to that, which is if you think about the media ecosystem overall, a bright spot is nonprofit media organizations who do have a lot of free and accessible information, because reporting is expensive, which is why those organizations have paywalls, and that's their business model. But like the ecosystem of information these days is just so rich, and there's so many sources, thankfully. So,
But I'm glad you spoke up for that, because I truly believe if you can afford to, please do subscribe to reliable news of any kind. I'm not going to tell you which brands, but please do consider supporting it if you can afford to, because it's worth supporting high quality content. And frankly, opinion is cheap. Sending people to travel to distant places or difficult places, to go on the ground, to go to real communities and talk to people, that costs money.
let's go back there in the white. Yeah, you. Yeah.
Okay. Hi.
Hi.
There's just so much white. Hello. I'm Teresa. I'm a Master's of International Economics and Development at UC San Diego. And I was an intern here, and I'm also an international student. And I'm from Mexico City. And you briefly mentioned about students, pursuing OPT opportunities here, etc. But I feel like right now we find ourselves in a moment where censorship becomes an issue that we really are scared of. So my question is, how do you envision a world, or how can we make this a world in which international students can engage in conversation and, engage in a more inclusive international affairs conversation when we have this fear of censorship?
Well, Teresa, I wish I had the answer to that. But first, let me begin by thanking you for your interest in studying in the United States, which I do not take for granted. And I fear that if the current trajectory continues, more international students, brilliant, inspiring young people who have so much to offer, they're going to decide to study in other places, because the US is not the only option. Am I allowed to offer that opinion? And I think the Europeans and Asian countries, there are a lot of places saying, hey, come here, because there's actually going to be an open economic environment here. And so I think we are, unfortunately, as a nation, really dealing ourselves a serious setback if we continue down the path of blocking international students and scholars from coming to America, where they can learn and where we can learn from them. So that's point number one. Secondly, I would say I'm especially worried as a journalist in the First Amendment and free expression implications of admitting people to the United States based on or after a screening of what they say on social media. I think that's very anti-American. I don't know how to reverse this climate other than to say that as journalists, telling the stories of how America is enriched by people-to-people exchange of ideas, information, intellectual property, scholarship, enriches and strengthens the United States. And I'm deeply committed to that belief.
You're right there.
Oh my god. Okay. Hi. First, thank you for talking with us. I know that your throat is scratchy, but it made this whole thing way cooler. And my name is Rani. I go to Stanford in the least elitist way possible. I'm very sorry. I'm a reporter at The Nation, and I cover climate and USAID cuts. I really wanted to ask about social media, because there's this idea that a lot of people who are on social media aren't actually creating news. They're just compiling it. And is that a form of journalism? And in that case, is it the role of traditional journalists in such a polarized climate to actually come in and then reach more audiences by going onto a platform like this, even if it means that they're more personalized, even if it means that it seems like they're biased because it's their face on a screen as opposed to their name on an article? Well,
Millie's actually the true expert on this. Are you insisting that I try to answer?
I'll jump in where you
No,
want me to.
but look, I mean, social media, we're 20 years into this era, and it's gone through a lot of changes. I think when Millie and I worked together in the mid-teens, is that 2016, 17, etc. It was still this era. Look, publishers felt they had to work with social media, right? And so there was a time when every time Facebook had a pivot to a new strategy, it was like, okay, well now we have to supply content for that new mode or strategy. And ultimately, Facebook, Meta, and other social media companies were not reliable partners. I think their interest in the media was very transactional and very short-lived. Facebook's interest in fact-checking ended up being short-lived. And so, Millie and I have both been veterans of conferences where we've been assured by people from these giant tech companies, oh yeah, they're interested in reliability and accuracy. And I think that, these are big companies. There are some people who are interested in those things and care about them and care about safety and trust. Unfortunately, I think economic imperatives have usually taken priority over a trust-based system. So what does that mean? I don't think that we can ignore platforms because they are an important way of reaching audiences. But I do think that every institution from CFR to, a media brand has to be very mindful and very thoughtful, very intentional, very deliberate about what we're putting out there. And I think if social media can help draw people back to other sources of information, it can be very, very helpful. I'm a little bit worried about, and actually I'm very admiring of people who can distill a complex foreign policy thing into like a 45-second video. I mean, if you can do that well and you're reaching people, that actually needs to be encouraged. It is not the traditional 800 to 1,200 word article that a lot of us older journalists were used to, but it's actually, frankly, the way people are consuming information. So I think we're in a world where traditional media and social media have to be in a kind of coexistence, even if that is at times uncomfortable.
Let's go with you right there.
Hello, my name is Ehianeta Aragan. I currently work as a policy specialist at Google, and I'm an incoming master's student at Johns Hopkins University. My question is about this erosion of trust, particularly as it regards to legacy media, not only from the consumers of that media, but from journalists themselves. In the past, I'd say 3 to 5 years, I've seen a lot of journalists either impacted by layoffs or choosing to leave because of censorship or other internal issues at their media organizations, which leads a lot of young people who are interested in getting really good news with questions about where to look. So my question for you is for young people who are interested in figuring out where to find trustworthy sources, whether that's specific people's Substacks or whether that's independent media, do you have concrete recommendations about places where people can look to find quality sources as they're trying to become informed citizens?
It's the most important question. And I think even 5 or 10 years ago, I would have said trust institutions that have been around a long time and have high standards. I'm not saying don't do that, but I also think that's become an inadequate answer. I think what we need a lot more of is just a general level of information literacy. And I've moved away from suggesting to people what to read. That's very dangerous territory. But I have some suggestions about how to read. Whatever the source is, whether it's some Substacker or The Guardian, who is behind this, who owns it, who funds it? The people who are writing or creating this content, this video, whatever, where do they live? How do they make their money? If they're trying to make money primarily from my fear and anger or the invasion of my privacy, I might want to move away from them more. If they're trying to, if they're I was saying that nonprofits are only, but it's you look at people's motivations, be skeptical readers, right? I think a lot of people are inherently very skeptical towards all news sources right now. And by the way, some of that's actually healthy. But I think there's a difference between skepticism and total cynicism or nihilism. So I think people are going to Substack to Heather Richardson, or other thinkers. They're this person seems authoritative. But I think you have to look at the motivations and look at and also funding and governance matter a lot, right? Whatever you choose to read or spend time with, ask, how is this governed? Who is it run by? What's the economic model? And again, if you're drawn to things that are primarily existing to sow more fear, anger, and distrust in the world, who is that serving? What interests is that serving? If you're going to places like CFR.org that seem to have authoritative, reliable information that's widely accessible and is based on expertise and on knowledge and on evidence, well, maybe that's worth spending more time on. So it's more like how to read that I hope we can impart, especially to today's really young people, today's students, rather than like what to read. Because I think telling people what to read or watch is kind of not going to be effective. Telling people how to be more discerning consumers of information, that offers, in my view, a path forward.
You say you had a virtual question?
We'll take the next question from Carlos Rodriguez.
Hi, my name is Carlos Rodriguez. I'm currently in between jobs, so I don't have an institutional affiliation. But my question is about journalism in Gaza and on the Gaza Strip. We've seen over 100 journalists there that have been killed by Israel this year. And so how can we exist in a reality where that can happen abroad, and then there's very little mention of that in the legacy media here in the United States?
Hi, Carlos. Thank you for your question. I'm not an area specialist. I do agree with you, and I believe strongly the Committee to Protect Journalists is the most reliable source of information about threats to media workers, and they have indeed documented the deaths of dozens of media workers. And that includes, by the way, the vital logistical and support staff that make media possible. People who are not in front of a camera necessarily, or whose byline is not in the story, but they're providing translation or other services, including driving people around, including support for media workers. There has been an unacceptable, casualty level among people who are trying to get the truth out. And I think that is appalling and needs to be condemned. At the same time, I think it's important not to paint with too broad a brush. I do think that there are a lot of journalism. There's a lot of good journalism coming out of the Middle East. And don't just take my word for it. I'm on the board of the Pulitzer Prizes. If you look at some of the winners this year, they reflect a pluralism of ideas and perspectives. There was a writer for The New Yorker who won a Pulitzer for commentary, who is Gazan and is writing about conditions back in his home community. And so I think give media a chance. I think there are courageous, just to give places like the New York Times and Reuters credit, they're among the few places in the world where Palestinian and Israeli and other journalists are working side by side to tell truthful stories about what's going on in this horrible, violent conflict. So do try to find sources who are on the ground trying to do this difficult and dangerous work, while also recognizing legitimately how dangerous it is when media workers are hurt or killed.
Let's go right here.
Hi, thank you so much. Alexa, Alex Martinuk, actually fellow HCHS and Queensite. My question, kind of building on the last question, I work on Ukraine, Razum for Ukraine, a nonprofit based here in New York, and I'm curious about the underrepresented voices internationally. So very, very often we see people that are affected by conflict. Their word isn't necessarily taken or there's lack of trust, right, in kind of understanding conflict through the eyes of people experiencing conflict. So in the context of Ukraine, I've heard, journalists, Pulitzer Prize winning journalists kind of say, they're just angry when kind of taking, expert opinions from think tankers, journalists in Ukraine. And I'm curious, how we build that trust in, trusting a Ukrainian to tell the story of Ukraine rather than the international journalist coming and telling the story of Ukraine. Because very often we see that, American voices on Ukraine are much more respected in government here, as well as, by the general public. So.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I think part of it is the voices, letting people tell the stories of their own communities and prioritizing that, not just through the filter of a Western news source. You've identified that. I would also argue that you've identified an important elitist bias within the media that's actually, in my mind, more interesting than ideological bias, which we could talk all day about. But there's a bias toward experts, no offense, CFR, and think tank scholars, people with a lot of credentials. We need that perspective because they often have geostrategic or economic expertise. And we also need, because journalism is fundamentally not a social science, it's a narrative craft. It's ultimately part of the humanities. We also need true stories about how people are really living life on the ground. And I think the best journalists try to balance that. They do pay attention to elite decision makers and experts and commentators, but they're also trying to connect it with the real lived experiences of people who are affected by crisis or by trauma. And so I think in journalism, you ultimately need that you need both of that. And sometimes the balance isn't quite right. So thank you for that observation.
Let's go back there. There, back. Yeah, there's no one behind you.
Emmanuel Thomas, Senate Armed Services alum, currently government affairs at Accenture. And I'm from Jamaica, Queens, so just right down the block. I'm a policy guy. I'd like it to stay that way. But I'm Haitian myself as well. I've found that, like the gentleman stood up there in Ukraine, there's a huge conflict in Haiti. There's also a lot of mistrust on places like the New York Times, Reuters, who are reporting from it. So for someone like me who might be interested in getting into online journalism, whether it's Substack or YouTube or wherever else, what advice would you have for someone with a different background who might be interested in getting into journalism on the side?
Yeah, I wish I had the perfect answer to that, because I've kind of come through more mainstream institutions. I think the good news is that in some ways the barriers to entry are far lower, and like people are attracting audiences by being authentic, credible, and knowledgeable. One Haitian American journalist I'm friends with, Gary Pierre at the Haitian Times, who, by the way, is a former New York Times reporter. He's like done a really incredible work. He did work after the Ohio comments about Haitian immigrants there. And so, I think part of it is, you don't have to have a license to practice journalism. Like, you can commit acts of journalism and do that, like acts of kindness. But like, you can do acts of journalism through observation, reflection, a mix of personal experience, reporting. Like, you can report about the communities that you know to be effective. You can do video interviews. So I think part of it is like taking an entrepreneurial approach is probably a good idea. Now, I don't know as much about, because I've never started a startup. I'm not nearly as courageous as to do that. But I think that you can be entrepreneurial and think about reaching, people that you're trying to reach through new platforms. It's like there's actually a lot of opportunity for that, because for better or worse, this is an era of fragmentation. And people who are genuinely interested, deeply interested in Haiti, will want to hear voices of Haitians and the Haitian diaspora. And that's where you can hopefully play a role.
I also think your background and combining both of these things is really interesting too.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be
as
like
in your work.
It doesn't have to be
too.
like your night job. It can be like a mixture, an extension of what you do the day to day.
Hi, so my name is Sarah Hanady. I'm a recent graduate of Middle Eastern Studies from Harvard University, and I used to be a Syrian refugee. Hopefully soon I'll be American. So this like bridging of two worlds has always been happening, but right now, in the last 10 years, I've been working on storytelling in English about the refugee experience, but now I'm trying to kind of reach back. I want to ask you about your opinion on the role of media in transitional democracies, hopefully democracies, especially like in the case of Syria or after revolutions. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on the subject, but I do know that I follow institutions like Media Development Investment Fund. And like, look, one of the challenges right now, and it relates to the USAID cuts, is that, to be frank, in many parts of the world, like, the tradition is different. And so it hasn't been as clear cut of like, you're a journalist and not an activist. I think if you're from a rich Western country, that distinction totally makes sense given the context. But it's like in emerging democracies, frankly, USAID funding did play a role or has played a role. European aid funds have played a role in helping to build out media infrastructure. So I worry a lot about the disinvestment in that. I don't know what the answers are. I do think that what you're doing in terms of telling the stories of refugees from the experience of someone who's been a refugee or an asylum seeker is crucially important. I was in this room just a couple of weeks ago watching this amazing film called Khartoum about the crisis in Sudan. These filmmakers did such a beautiful job. It was told through 5 Sudanese people. And yes, there was context about the government forces and who's fighting who, but it was about 5 human stories. And I learned more from that movie than, frankly, I mean, not more, but I've learned as much from that film as I have in reading, Declan Walsh's amazing reporting for the New York Times. It's a different way of reaching people. And so I think, and a lot of people, frankly, are going to maybe more likely to watch a movie about people they can understand and see and relate to than read a lot of complex text-based journalism. You need both. And so I hope that there's space for both. And I hope that people in countries like Syria, as it's being rebuilt, will invest in media infrastructure, because it is an important part of that country's, rebuilding, and an important source of support for the many people in the Syrian diaspora.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. Okay, one more.
And I'm sticking around for the reception,
Yeah.
so please feel free.
With the red tie.
Nice tie.
Thank you. Cameron Shapiro. I'm a recent graduate from Carnegie Mellon University, Master's of Public Policy. I'm also a Council on Foreign Relations Young Professional Briefings member. A quick question. Could you speak to the dissolution, the dismantling of VOA and of Radio Free Asia, of Radio Free Europe, and what that means for American soft power abroad?
Yeah, Mike Bromowitz, the head of VOA, and Amanda Bennett, the former CEO of U.S. Agency for Government Media, are both friends of mine. Full disclosure. I'm not a subject matter expert, but I believe that this is very, very dangerous for several reasons. I think Voice of America, first of all, has been an important source of American soft power, honoring the late Joe Nye in the world. I think that, a lot of people currently are forgetting the roots of a lot of this media during the Cold War. And again, I'm not saying the Cold War media was always perfect, but I think VOA, especially the role that the VOA firewall played, was very, very important. By the way, as an American journalist, you might think, and in some ways I am uncomfortable with the idea of any government-supported media, but there has to be nuance there. And VOA was trying to cover America impartially, with professionals really dedicating their lives to that, to audiences overseas, especially in closed societies and living under repressive regimes. And VOA's foreign language work, its non-English work, was so important, especially in less common languages where there were talk about deserts of news, or talk about a lack of reliable, independent, authoritative information. I am heartened to see the European Union taking some preliminary steps to support Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Bei Fang at Radio Free Asia is another friend. And I hope that these institutions and entities, and RFE and I think RFA, have separate nonprofit existences that are a little bit distinct from VOA. I hope they can find a way to survive. But the dismantling of VOA is ultimately going to harm the United States. I do believe that, and I hope that someday that decision can be reversed. Thank you for drawing attention to it.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's hybrid session, and thank you to Sewell. Please note that the video and transcript of today's meeting will be posted on CFR's website, cfr.org. Please visit. We hope those of you who are joining us in person today can stay for the reception at the Pratt House. So we'll both see you there.
Thank you so much.